Hello, and welcome to episode 15 of Sarastro's Star Wars Legion painting series. In this episode we're going to paint the B1 battle droids from Fantasy Flight Games' Star Wars Legion. The battle droids are beautifully detailed miniatures with posable parts and plenty of character. Due to the number of droids that I'll potentially be fielding, I'll be using a nice quick method for getting the droids ready for battle, but I'll also be having some fun with a bit of weathering and exploring some optional colour schemes. Let's take a look at the painting stages. I'm going to begin by assembling the miniatures using some plastic glue, before priming in black, followed with some zenithal highlights sprayed from above. Alternatively, a plain prime in white would also be okay. I'll then be using some Citadel contrast paint to quickly provide some colour, shading and, by controlling where we let the paint settle, highlights all in one simple step. That just leaves some optional finishing touches, which could include playing with some alternative colour schemes, along with some simple battle damage and some basing. Let's begin. Because the droids come on sprues in several parts, you'll ideally want a pair of plastic cutters to remove the pieces. All of the parts of each droid are labelled on the sprue with a letter, so when we clip them out, we just need to remember to keep all of the parts which have the same letter in a single pile. When cutting, it's a good idea to keep the flat side of the cutters as close to the part as possible, to reduce the amount of excess plastic left on the model. It's up to you how many models you assemble at a time, but building them in batches is quite an efficient way to work, provided you don't mix the pieces up by accident. After clipping the parts out, I'm using a craft knife to clean up some of the areas where the model was attached to the sprue. Because of the type of plastic used for the Separatists and the Speeder, it's recommended that plastic glue be used for gluing the parts together. There's no strict order for assembling the figures, but I'd recommend first gluing the two parts of the head, using just a small amount of glue. This can then be put to one side to be attached at the end. Next, for the regular troopers, I've chosen to glue on the arms, which is the only slightly tricky part of the process. There are a few ways we could do this. Here I've first glued the weapon arm to the torso, which I'm leaving for a couple of minutes to partially set. I'm then gluing on the left arm and guiding the wrist into the hand socket on the weapon. The other approach, which you might find slightly easier, is to first glue the left arm to the weapon. We can then glue both arms to the torso in one go. Before the glue fully sets, the arms can be raised or lowered to your liking to create a nice bit of variation, as you can see here. Next I'm going to glue on the backpack as well as the legs, which is very straightforward. And I'm now gluing the droids to the base. Finally, I'm gluing on the head. I'm doing this last so as to avoid any potential clashes between the head and the aerial on the backpack, but also to allow me to create some final variation of the pose by adjusting the direction and tilt of the head. I'm now assembling the unit leader, taking care to fix the binoculars on the right way round. I've also chosen to glue the legs and the head on before attaching the arms. I really want the head on now to allow me to bring the binoculars up to the correct position. And I'm now attaching the arms. Here on my second unit leader, I've chosen to glue the arms in the lowered position. And finally, I'm gluing down the aerial and the blaster on the back. There's not much else to say about the remaining specialists, except that for the E60R Trooper, you'd obviously begin by gluing the viewfinder into the weapon. And this too may be glued in the lowered position if you like. Once assembled, the droids are ready for priming, and as usual I'll be using the airbrush to prime the figures in black. I'm now providing some zenithal highlights, firstly using Vallejo's Cold Grey, which I'm applying from the direction of a rough halo around the figure. This will result in an essentially grey miniature, but with some more black areas in the recesses and shadows. I'm now applying some dead white, more or less directly from above. If you'd rather prime in a single colour, then white would be okay, and here I'm priming a sample droid in white for the purposes of comparison. Here you can see how a plain prime in white compares with a figure that's received zenithal highlights, and later on we'll see some subtle differences in how these two look after we've applied the contrast paint. For now, it's just worth repeating that although I favour the look of the zenithal highlights, a plain prime in white is absolutely fine. Let's now add some colour. For all of the bodywork of the droids, I'm going to use an equal mix of Aggaros Dunes and Skeleton Horde. For a slightly more muted tone, Skeleton Horde on its own would also be fine. I'm also preparing some of the contrast medium in a neighbouring well, although this isn't absolutely essential. I'm now applying the contrast paint exactly like a wash or a shade, covering the entire figure except for the blaster. We can see that this behaves just like a very concentrated shade, collecting in all of the recesses and producing a pretty strong level of contrast. The paint may also collect in areas we don't necessarily want, however, such as some of the upturned sections of plating, which would typically want to appear lighter, but we can deal with this in a moment. I'm not too worried if some of this gets on the blaster, as the black we'll be adding on top will mostly cover it up. Whilst that's still wet, I'm going to give the brush a quick clean and dampen it with some of the medium. And I'm now thinning or brushing away the contrast paint from the areas that I'd like to remain brightest, including the top of the head and the backpack. This will save us from having to add any highlights here later on. I've dampened the brush with the contrast medium just to ensure that I don't interfere with the properties of the paint by introducing water into the mix. You can see I'm frequently unloading the brush on my hand or some nearby kitchen paper. I'm also soaking up any unwanted excess from elsewhere on the miniature. This only takes a minute to do, but I think gives us a cleaner looking finish and, as mentioned, really helps to maximise the contrast, negating the need to add any further highlights. Notice too how nicely the contrast paints synergise with the zenithal highlights, giving us both high levels of localised contrast along with an effective global level of light and shade. That being said, here on the left you can see that the droid primed in plain white also turned out very nicely. Besides the differences in global contrast, the other thing to be aware of is how the contrast paint appears less saturated when applied over the zenithal highlights, owing to the levels of grey and black underneath. This isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing, although in this case I quite like it. It's just something to be aware of. Next I'm going to use Black Templar to paint all of the weapons. If you accidentally hit any of the bodywork like I've done here, you can either leave the mistake as battle damage, or simply wipe it away with a wet brush. For the unit leader's binoculars, I'm going to first use some pure white to clean up any areas that got hit with the brown tone earlier on. And I'm now applying some Apothecary White. Once dry, we can see that with very little effort we now have some perfectly fine battle droids fresh off the assembly line, and you could skip to painting the base and calling the figures done if you like. Otherwise join me now for some optional finishing touches. I'm going to begin by adding the distinctive yellow markings that we find on the unit leaders. To do that, I'm going to begin by painting the top and rear of the head using Averland Sunset. You can see I don't mind going over the smaller gaps with this. And I'm now drawing the circle on the chest. I'm now going to brighten this with the addition of some Flash Gitz yellow. And I'm now avoiding the gaps between the segments when I apply this. I'm now using pure Flash Gitz yellow. Before adding some battle damage, I've chosen to create some additional colour schemes, starting with a look based on the security battle droids. For that, I'm going to paint the upper shoulders, firstly using Vallejo's Burnt Red. You could equally darken whatever standard red you like with some black or dark green to achieve a similar tone. There's also a red strip that runs down the side of the torso. I'm now placing a thin horizontal strip on the lower chest. And I'm painting the rear section of the head. I'm now going to add some quick highlights, firstly by mixing in some flat red. and finally I'm using pure flat red. Next I've chosen to try out the look of my personal favourite scheme, which is the blue design of the pilot battle droids. For that I'm starting with some dark Prussian blue. Notice that the design is a little different from that of the security droid. I'm now lightening this with some flat blue. And here I'm using pure flat blue. I've decided to mix in a little white for my final highlight. With that done, I'm going to add some simple battle damage, by first using a dark mix of Leadbelcher and black to add some chips and scratches. The paint wants to be quite opaque for this. I'm now creating a much lighter tone by mixing some Stormhost Silver into some white. This is especially good for creating chipped edge highlights, and can also look good when applied on top of the darker scratches we applied a moment ago. I'm also using this quite liberally for the E60R. I'm now going to base the droids to match the terrain I'm going to be playing on, so I'm first creating some texture using Vallejo's Brown Earth basing paste. Once fully dry, I'm going to pick out the texture with a simple dry brush using Tyrant Skull. I'm now going to shade the base using an equal mix of Agrax Earthshade, Fuegan Orange and Lahmian Medium. As well as shading the ground, I'm also going halfway up the legs to create the impression of some dusty weathering. I've also chosen to provide a light sprinkling of Army Painter's Brown Battleground, which I'm applying over a layer of thinned PVA glue. And as usual, I like to paint the rims of the bases in black. Finally, before spraying on a matte varnish, I've chosen to paint the lenses of the binoculars using red over a white undercoat. I'm now mixing a light pink to add a small glint to each lens. And as usual, I'm finishing the figures off with a coat of Tester's Dull Coat for protection. And this completes the B1 Battle Droids. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the episode. Do please let me know if you have by leaving a like and by subscribing to the channel to ensure you don't miss future episodes. As always, you'll find a full product list in the video description below, where you can also find links to where I can be reached on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify and Twitter. Join me again soon as we continue painting the Clone Wars miniatures from Star Wars Legion. Happy painting!